Wealth, in most popular narratives, arrives as a sudden event, a breakthrough moment, a single decision that changed everything, a lucky break that opened the right door at the right time. The story of how someone went from financial constraint to financial stability is almost always told in retrospect, and retrospective accounts tend to compress what was actually a long, gradual process into a series of dramatic turning points that make the outcome seem more sudden and more mysterious than it actually was. The reality, documented consistently across research on financial development and behavioral economics, is considerably less dramatic and considerably more accessible. Wealth, understood here as the progressive movement from financial fragility toward increasing financial stability, capacity, and eventually independence, tends to be preceded by a specific set of behavioral, cognitive, and habitual shifts that are identifiable before the financial outcomes they eventually produce become visible. These shifts are not guarantees. No behavioral pattern or cognitive orientation guarantees a specific financial outcome, and anyone who claims otherwise is overstating what the evidence supports. Individual circumstances vary significantly, and financial development is influenced by factors well beyond any individual's behavioral patterns alone. What the research does suggest, with reasonable consistency, is that certain behavioral and cognitive patterns tend to precede financial development, that they appear in documented accounts of financial progress across different starting points and different domains as reliable antecedents of the kind of sustained, compounding effort that financial development requires. This session examines 3 of those patterns in depth, not as predictions, not as guarantees, but as evidence-informed signals, specific, identifiable shifts in how a person relates to money, effort, time, and opportunity that tend to be associated with the kind of development that, over a realistic timescale, produces meaningfully different financial outcomes. Understanding them precisely, not as inspirational concepts, but as specific behavioral and cognitive patterns with identifiable mechanisms, is what makes them practically useful rather than merely encouraging. Sign 1. Your relationship with delayed reward has fundamentally shifted. Of all the behavioral patterns associated with financial development, the relationship between a person and delayed reward may be the most foundational. This is not simply a matter of patience in the conventional sense. It is something more specific and more mechanistic, a shift in how the cognitive system weights future outcomes relative to immediate ones, and in how that weighting influences the daily decisions that financial development depends on. To understand why this matters, it helps to understand the baseline. Research in behavioral economics on what is called temporal discounting, the tendency to assign lower value to outcomes that are further in the future, has established that this tendency is not simply a personality trait that some people have more of than others. It is a fundamental feature of how human cognitive systems evaluate options. All people discount future rewards to some degree. The question is not whether discounting occurs, but how steeply it occurs, and what that steepness means for the practical decisions a person makes about money, time, and effort. Steep temporal discounting produces a specific and recognizable pattern of financial behavior. It tends to produce strong preference for immediate financial gratification, spending rather than saving, consuming rather than investing, taking the certain smaller reward now rather than the uncertain larger reward later. It tends to make the effort required for long-term financial development feel disproportionately costly relative to the anticipated reward, which makes sustained engagement with that effort harder to maintain. Shallow temporal discounting, a more balanced weighting of present and future outcomes, tends to produce the opposite pattern. It makes saving feel more natural, investment feel more worthwhile, and the delayed rewards of sustained financial effort feel more genuinely valuable in current decision-making. It does not eliminate the pull of immediate rewards, but it reduces the degree to which that pull dominates financial decisions at the expense of longer-term outcomes. The shift from steep to shallower temporal discounting is not a sudden change in personality. It is a gradual recalibration that tends to occur through a combination of accumulated experience, deliberate practice, and the development of a more concrete and more emotionally engaged relationship with future financial outcomes. What does this shift look like in practice? Before the financial outcomes it tends to be associated with are visible, it tends to look like a changed relationship with small financial decisions. The person who is experiencing this shift begins to notice a different felt sense in the moment of a small spending decision, a moment of genuine evaluation that was not previously present, in which the future cost of the present expenditure is felt as real rather than abstract. Not agonizing deliberation over every purchase, but a qualitatively different relationship with the decision, one in which the future self who will experience the consequences of today's choice is genuinely present in the evaluation. It tends to look like a changed relationship with the concept of investment, not only financial investment, but the broader category of present effort or resource in exchange for future return. The person experiencing this shift begins to find genuinely rewarding the act of putting something toward the future, whether that is money into savings, time into skill development, or effort into relationship building that will not produce immediate tangible return. And it tends to look like a changed relationship with waiting. Not passive waiting, but the active, engaged continuation of effort during the period between investment and visible return. The person who has genuinely shifted their relationship with delayed reward is able to remain engaged and motivated during that period in a way that was not previously possible, not because the period has become easier, but because the anticipated future outcome is weighted heavily enough in their cognitive evaluation to sustain engagement through it. This shift, when it occurs genuinely rather than aspirationally, is one of the more consistently documented behavioral antecedents of financial development. It changes the character of hundreds of small daily decisions in ways that tend to compound, over time, into significantly different financial trajectories. Sign 2. You have begun treating financial knowledge as a serious and ongoing investment. There is a specific and identifiable shift in how people relate to financial knowledge that tends to precede meaningful financial development, and it is more specific than simply becoming interested in finance or beginning to read about money. The shift is from passive consumption of financial information to active, organized, application-oriented engagement with financial knowledge. The distinction is worth examining carefully, because it is easy to mistake one for the other, and the two tend to produce very different outcomes. Passive consumption of financial information is widespread. Books, podcasts, videos, articles on personal finance, investing, wealth building, and financial independence are consumed in significant volumes by large numbers of people who are genuinely interested in improving their financial situations. That consumption, in most cases, tends to produce limited practical effect on financial outcomes, not because the information is poor, but because consumption alone does not produce the kind of organized, application-ready knowledge that actually changes financial behavior. Active, organized, application-oriented engagement with financial knowledge is different in character. It begins with a more specific orientation toward information. Rather than broadly consuming whatever financial content is available and interesting, the person who has made this shift approaches financial knowledge with a specific question in mind. What do I specifically need to understand in order to make better decisions about my specific financial situation in the next specific period? That specificity changes what gets learned. It filters out the large proportion of financial information that is either not applicable to the person's actual situation, not actionable at their current stage of development, or too general to translate into specific behavioral change. It concentrates learning on the specific knowledge that is most directly relevant to the next actionable step. It also changes how what gets learned is processed. Information engaged with through the lens of a specific application question tends to be connected, during learning, to the specific decisions and behaviors it is relevant to. That connection is what makes information actionable rather than merely interesting. A person who learns about compound interest in the abstract retains a concept. A person who learns about compound interest while specifically evaluating a particular savings decision connects the concept to a specific behavioral choice and is significantly more likely to act on it. The second dimension of this shift is the development of an ongoing rather than an episodic relationship with financial knowledge. Most people who consume financial information do so in episodes, periods of heightened interest and engagement, typically triggered by a specific financial concern or a specific moment of aspiration, that are separated by longer periods of lower engagement. This episodic pattern tends to produce limited cumulative development of financial understanding, because each episode of engagement begins largely from the same baseline. The previous episode's learning has not been applied, integrated, or built upon sufficiently to provide a meaningfully more advanced starting point. An ongoing relationship with financial knowledge, in which learning is regular, cumulative, and consistently connected to application, tends to produce a compounding development of financial understanding over time. Each period of engagement builds on what previous periods produced. The questions being asked become progressively more sophisticated. The decisions being informed become progressively more consequential. The third dimension of this shift is perhaps the most telling. The person begins actively seeking out the knowledge held by people who have already navigated the specific financial challenges they are currently facing. This is different from generally admiring financially successful people or generally seeking inspiration from their stories. It is the specific, purposeful identification of the particular knowledge gaps that are most limiting current financial progress, and the deliberate pursuit of relationships, conversations, or resources that can address those specific gaps. This orientation tends to be associated with accelerated financial development, because the knowledge most relevant to navigating a specific challenge at a specific stage of financial development is often most efficiently accessed through people who have already navigated that challenge, rather than through general financial education that was not designed with the specific challenge in mind. When a person has made this shift from passive consumption to active, organized, application-oriented engagement with financial knowledge, the behavioral consequences tend to be visible before the financial outcomes are. Their financial decisions become more deliberate, more informed, and more consistent over time. The quality of the questions they ask about their financial situation improves, and the gap between what they know and what they do begins, gradually, to narrow. Sign 3. Your identity has begun to align with the behaviors financial development requires. Of the 3 signs examined in this session, this one is the most subtle, the most frequently overlooked, and arguably the most significant. It is the shift in how a person understands themselves in relation to financial development, the gradual movement of financial discipline, financial awareness, and the behaviors associated with building financial stability from the category of things they are trying to do into the category of things they simply are. This distinction between a behavior that is externally imposed through effort and a behavior that is internally consistent with self-concept matters enormously for the sustainability of financial development over the realistic timescale on which it occurs. Financial development, by definition, requires sustained behavioral consistency over extended periods. The specific behaviors that tend to be associated with financial development: consistent saving, deliberate investment, ongoing skill development, disciplined management of expenditure, sustained engagement with financial education, need to be maintained not for days or weeks, but for months and years. And they need to be maintained through the full range of conditions that those months and years will contain, including periods of low motivation, external pressure, competing demands, and the long stretches of invisible progress where the compounding effects of consistent behavior are accumulating but not yet visible. Maintaining behavioral consistency over that timescale through willpower alone, through the repeated application of deliberate effort to override the pull of competing impulses, is not reliably sustainable. Willpower is a limited cognitive resource that depletes with use and is subject to the full range of factors that affect cognitive performance: stress, sleep quality, competing cognitive demands, and the accumulated fatigue of sustained self-regulatory effort. Behavioral consistency that is supported by identity, that flows from a self-concept in which the behavior is understood as consistent with who the person is, tends to be significantly more sustainable. Not because it requires no effort, but because the effort required to maintain it is qualitatively different from the effort required to override competing impulses. It is the effort of doing what feels natural rather than the effort of resisting what feels natural. The practical question is what this identity shift actually looks like before the financial outcomes it tends to be associated with are clearly visible. It tends to look, first, like a changed internal response to the behavioral moments that financial development requires. A person who has not yet made this shift tends to experience the moment of choosing to save rather than spend, or to invest time in financial education rather than entertainment, as a moment of sacrifice, of giving up something valued in exchange for something more abstractly important. The behavior is performed, but it is performed against the grain of what feels natural in the moment. A person who has begun to make this shift tends to experience the same moment differently, not as sacrifice, but as consistency. The choice to save, to invest, to continue developing financial knowledge does not feel like giving something up. It feels like being who they are. The behavior has moved from the category of things they are trying to do into the category of things that are simply consistent with their self-understanding. This shift tends to show up, second, in how a person responds to the social dimension of financial development. Financial discipline, in many social environments, is not the norm. Spending patterns, consumption habits, and the implicit norms around money that characterize most social environments tend to create social pressure toward financial behaviors that are not consistent with deliberate financial development. For a person whose financial discipline is maintained primarily through willpower, this social pressure is a significant ongoing cost. The willpower required to maintain the behavior in the face of social pressure is added to the willpower required to maintain it in the face of internal competing impulses. For a person whose financial discipline has begun to become part of their self-concept, the social dimension changes character. The behavior is no longer something that needs to be defended against social pressure. It is simply part of who they are. Social norms that conflict with it are registered and navigated, but they tend not to produce the same internal conflict that they produce for someone whose financial discipline is not yet integrated into self-concept. The third way this shift tends to show up is in how a person relates to financial setbacks and unexpected financial disruptions. For a person whose financial development behaviors are maintained primarily through external effort, a significant setback, an unexpected expense, a period of reduced income, a financial decision that did not produce the intended result, tends to disrupt the behavioral pattern. The willpower that was sustaining the pattern is redirected toward managing the setback, and the pattern erodes. For a person whose financial behaviors have begun to become part of their identity, the same setback produces a different response. The disruption is real and requires genuine management. But the fundamental behavioral orientation, the commitment to continued financial development despite the disruption, tends not to be fundamentally threatened by it. The person adapts the specific behaviors to the changed circumstances while maintaining the fundamental orientation, because the orientation has become part of who they are rather than a behavior they are maintaining through effort. How does this identity shift actually develop, and what tends to be associated with its development? Research on identity and behavioral change tends to support a behavioral-first model. Identity does not typically shift first and then enable behavioral change. It tends to shift in response to accumulated behavioral evidence, the gradual accumulation of consistent behavior that provides the self-concept with evidence from which to update. Each consistent financial behavior, each instance of saving when the pull to spend was present, each deliberate financial decision made from a considered rather than an impulsive place. Each period of engagement with financial knowledge when other activities were available contributes a small amount of behavioral evidence to the developing financial identity. Over time, with sufficient consistency, that evidence tends to accumulate into a self-concept that genuinely incorporates financial discipline as part of its definition. This process is not linear, and it is not always clearly visible in progress. There will be periods of behavioral inconsistency that feel like regression. There will be moments when the old patterns reassert themselves, and the distance between the current self-concept and the intended one seems larger than it did before. These are normal features of identity-level behavioral change, not evidence that the process is failing. What tends to matter, over the realistic timescale on which this shift occurs, is the overall direction of the accumulated behavioral evidence, whether it is consistently pointing toward greater financial discipline, greater financial awareness, and greater consistency between stated financial priorities and actual financial behavior. When the accumulated behavioral evidence is genuinely, if imperfectly, building in that direction, the identity shift is occurring, even when it is not yet clearly visible in the financial outcomes it is gradually building toward. Bringing the three signs together. The three signs examined in this session: the shift in relationship with delayed reward, the shift toward active and organized engagement with financial knowledge, and the gradual alignment of identity with the behaviors financial development requires, are not independent phenomena. They are, in practice, deeply interconnected. Each one tends to support and reinforce the others. A person whose relationship with delayed reward has shifted tends to be more capable of sustaining the ongoing engagement with financial knowledge that the second sign describes, because the future payoff of that knowledge feels more genuinely valuable in current decision-making. A person who has developed an ongoing, organized relationship with financial knowledge tends to be better equipped to make the specific behavioral decisions that generate the behavioral evidence from which the identity shift described in the third sign develops. And a person whose identity has begun to align with financial development behaviors tends to be more capable of maintaining the relationship with delayed reward that the first sign describes, because the behaviors associated with delayed gratification feel consistent with self-concept rather than opposed to it. Together, these three shifts tend to create a self-reinforcing developmental dynamic, a gradual increase in the coherence between values, behaviors, knowledge, and identity in the domain of financial development that tends to make continued progress both more likely and more sustainable over the realistic timescale on which meaningful financial development occurs. None of this is guaranteed. None of it is immune to the full range of external circumstances that influence financial outcomes in ways that go beyond any individual's behavioral patterns. And none of it produces visible financial outcomes immediately or reliably within any specific short-term time frame. What it tends to be associated with, over a realistic and honest engagement with the process, is the kind of gradual, compounding development that retrospective accounts of financial progress almost always describe, when they are told honestly rather than compressed into the dramatic narrative that makes the outcome seem more sudden than it actually was. The signs described in this session are not dramatic.